I'm really excited to be here today to talk about the economics of privacy with Alessandro Acquisti. Alessandro is a distinguished professor of economics at MIT, and he was previously at Carnegie Mellon. He has had a very long and distinguished career in this area. I would call him the leading economist of privacy. He has, time and again over the years, produced papers and findings that are truly insightful, surprising, fascinating, and really impactful. And so I'm really excited to talk to you today about uh, the economics of privacy, and a topic I think is just fascinating topic. And I guess to begin, I'd like to start at the big broad level. And there are kind of in economics, there are different approaches to economics. For a long time, there's been a traditional approach, and then a more modern approach. I mean, it's been going on for a while, but a shift where uh, to behavioral economics. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you could explain a little bit about these two different approaches to economics and broadly what's going on in the field.
Oh, certainly. Thank you, Dan, for having me here. It's always a pleasure to connect with you. The, um, the economics of privacy itself went through um, a few um, a few variations over time. In fact, it dates back to the late 1970s, early 1980s, when Chicago school scholars like Posner and Stigler started talking about privacy from an economic angle, not a very favorable angle, essentially looking at privacy as a hiding of negative information, and hiding information from the market creates frictions and reduces economic efficiency. Then we had in the mid 1990s a revival with scholars such as Hal Varian, Eli Noam, who were economists, but also understood computer science, information technology, bringing in a more evolved, less monolithic concept of privacy among economics, and studying things such as the economic implications of encryption, the nascent digital economy and what that implied for privacy. And then really after 2000, more or less, so with the World Wide Web, there was not just an explosion in internet services, there was also really an explosion in the academic interest among economists in this field. And the field evolved in many different directions. Economics of privacy can be about price discrimination, studying the impact that revealing a consumer taste or preferences can have on the price that the consumer will be charged, especially online, when they want to buy a product. Economics of privacy can be about identity theft or data breaches or behavior advertising, the extent to which behavior advertising creates wealth, creates benefits for stakeholders, or does not create benefits. And then lots of work, in fact, I would say an almost suspicious amount of work on the cost of privacy regulation. There has been lots of attention in my field on investigating the so-called unintended consequences of legislative initiatives such as the GDPR. And then, yes, indeed, as you mentioned, also this behavior economics angle, which I and others have been trying to propose in order to understand better how consumers make decisions and individuals make decisions about their privacy, especially online decisions, the extent to which they value privacy or not, the extent to which they try to find a balance between the need and desire to reveal and share and the need and desire to protect. So this is the big picture. And of course, I'm happy to go down any of each particular paths with you as you like.
Yeah, I think that that's great. And I guess I'll, you know, simplify in terms of my very simple understanding of one of the key differences between traditional economics and behavioral economics,
Mhm.
is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but traditional economics worked a lot with a kind of theoretical picture of behavior, of how people decided, and it assumed that people are operating, fully rationally, fully informed, and how they would make decisions reasonably. Behavioral economics shifted the focus to look empirically at how people are actually deciding, how they're actually behaving, what their attitudes actually are. And
Mhm.
uh, you've done a lot of work in the behavioral front, and traditional too, but on the behavioral front, uh, you've shown that the behaviors are not always rational, do not always seemingly follow what we would think a reasonable person might do or how they might behave. And I'm wondering what you've learned in doing this empirical study and actually looking at, well, how are people behaving? What can be learned from doing that? What has your economic work shown about how people act when it comes to, especially the sharing of their personal data, allowing the use of their personal data?
Sure. So, first of all, yes, I believe that your initial characterization of these two approaches in economics to understanding consumer decision making, the traditional approach, which we call in the field neoclassical approach or neoclassical economics, and the behavioral approach, are distinguished because the former assumes consumer rationality, which in economics has a very particular meaning. Typically in the models, and by the way, I started myself as a modeler, as an economics modeler. Typically in these models, the consumer has full information and optimizes, chooses actions in order to optimize a certain function, such as maximizing consumer welfare, and uses all information available, quote unquote, rationally. So to maximize this objective function. In contrast, behavioral economics does not say that consumers are irrational or stupid or make wrong decisions. Rather, looks at how in reality consumer decision making is not adequately represented as a process of utility maximization by a agent who is able to consider all possible options available and always chooses the one that is the best for them. In contrast to the neoclassical view, behavior economics tends to point to the fact that consumers often have incomplete information. They, in particular, in the case of privacy, this is obvious. So we often do not know how much data about ourselves is being collected. We don't know how it is being used. We don't know what with consequences that may arise from such usage. And even if we add complete information, which we don't, and privacy policies don't address that gap for reasons that we can discuss if you like. Even if we add complete information, we would still be bounded in our rationality in that we would not make use of all that information. We would not consider all possible available options because that set is probably open-ended, maybe infinite sometimes. Rather, empirical research shows that consumers tend to use heuristics, simplified rules of thumb, such as in the case of privacy. Well, I've been buying from this merchant before and nothing bad has happened to my information, so probably I can keep buying from this merchant and things will be good. My data will not be compromised. And this heuristic could be a good heuristic, could be a heuristic which leads to satisfactory outcomes, or it may not. And finally, even if the consumer had complete information about everything happening in the market and unbounded power to process all this information, there will still be a number of behavioral factors. We often use the term biases, although that has become somewhat of a loaded term recently, which may still affect decision-making in unexpected and surprising manners, so that we would expect a consumer who prefers A to B and B to C to also prefer A to C, but in fact, under certain circumstances, that same consumer may prefer C to A, which is an inversion of preferences, which traditional neoclassical economics doesn't explain very well, but behavior economics can not only document happening in the marketplace, but it can also explain. And what I try to do in the early days of my research was indeed to use what we knew from behavioral economics and behavioral decision research and bring it into the privacy field. And the reason why I started doing that was that, although, as I mentioned earlier, I had been trained as a modeler, as an econ theory person, working with Halverian at Berkeley, near the end of my days in Berkeley, so close to my dissertation time, I and many others started noticing this strange dichotomy between people saying something about privacy, but perhaps doing something else. And which led to the question, do people really care? Which in turn led to the question, how can we model consumer behavior in a manner which realistically depicts what consumers in the real world do? And indeed, I believe that our traditional approach of representing consumers in their drive towards privacy as utility maximizers was insufficient or unsatisfactory. And that's when I started learning more about the behavior economics and bringing it into the field. And from that, many studies came out. Some of the studies were purely about taking one concept already used in behavior economics and just showing, hey, look, it has an application to privacy. In some other cases, we came up with some phenomena, we discovered some phenomena which seem to be somewhat germane, perhaps unique to the privacy field. An example of the former, so a traditional concept in behavior economics, which has a very powerful and important application to privacy, is the so-called endowment effect. And here I'm talking about research that scholars such as Thaler, Kahneman, Swiderski, giants of the behavior decision research field already discovered over 40 years ago, which reflects how individuals will give very different valuations to a product, depending on whether they feel they are endowed with ownership of that product or not. In the case of privacy, this as I'm not using the term carelessly, has enormous implications, because you will discover, and we found empirically, that consumers will give very, very different valuations to their personal data and to the privacy of their personal data, depending on whether you frame the problem as how much should I pay you for you to give me this sensitive information about yourself, versus how much would you be willing to pay to protect this sensitive information about yourself from being obtained by me. Just this change in framing can radically alter the valuations that people give to privacy. And this is, I said, enormously important for public policy, because sometimes we may look at data and we may, in my view, incorrectly conclude that consumers do not really care for privacy, while in fact the data we are seeing may reflect the fact that consumers in the particular state feel that they already have no privacy. They've already lost it, and therefore it's kind of pointless to try to pay money to protect something that is already gone. Finally, an example of the latter and of a phenomenon which we found was more germane to privacy was a study I'm particularly proud of with Laura Brandi-Marte, who is now in Arizona, and with George Lowenstein, who is at CMU, on the paradox of control. As you well know, Daniel, and you also wrote eloquent papers and books on this, control is a double-edged sword when it comes to privacy, because normatively speaking, we want people to have control over their personal information. That is even a definition, one of the many definitions of privacy. However, control can become a double-edged sword when it is used to make consumers feel that they are in control and push the responsibility of protection on them, when that feeling of being in control can paradoxically lead consumers to actually take more risk with their personal information. Essentially, imagine privacy settings on Facebook. They make you feel that you can really control your data because you can granularly select who will see this information. But in essence, you are forgetting that, you may be able to control whether or not your uncle or your grandmother or your friends see this photo, but you're not really able to control how much Facebook can know about you, how they can use the information and this photo with third parties, and so on and so forth. So control can paradoxically backfire. And by this, I do not mean that control is bad. I'm referring to the fact that the using behavioral economics to understand privacy decision-making sometimes can lead to surprising discoveries.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I want to drill down on one of the points you made and talk about the value of personal data.
Daniel, I no longer hear you. I wonder why.
Do you hear me now? Do you hear me now? You don't hear me at all? It perhaps has shifted your audio input somehow. It might have changed your...
Now I can hear you again.
Okay. It must have done some kind of a shift. Sometimes it will change your speaker or something. So I wanted to talk about the value of data. And I think the kind of a more, sometimes I'll see views that will say, or people that will argue, the value of personal data is the amount of money that people will accept for giving up their data. So if a company offers a 10-cent discount for a coupon or something, and someone gives up their data for that, then the value of data is 10 cents. Or if you give up your data to use Facebook, your value is valued at, how much is, the use of Facebook worth? And therefore you're trading your data for, a particular monetary value. The way I understand your work is that actually it's very complicated. We can't really look at things like that because of context. That, the way things are framed, the way the decisions are structured changes dramatically how people will make their choices. And so we can't just look at, simplistically, what price people give up their data for. So if I say, I want your data for $1, can I have your personal data? That doesn't mean your data is actually valued at $1. It's a lot more complicated. So I wonder if you could get into the valuation of data, because there's a lot of times where I'll hear people say, wow, we should turn personal data into property, and then we solve all the problems if we just allow people to sell their personal data, or we compensate people for their personal data. Problem solved. And my take on your work is actually it doesn't work like that.
Right, and starting from the very end, and then tracing back to the beginning of your question, the notion of data proprietization and markets for personal information is interestingly not a new notion. Has been discussed since the mid 1990s. To my knowledge, the very first economist to propose it was Kenneth Loudon. At the time at NYU, who in 1996 published in the Communications of the ACM a paper, lovely paper, that was titled, if I remember correctly, something like Markets and Privacy, and was proposing essentially markets for personal data. There were some technical challenges at the time to implement them. Nowadays, in theory, we would be able to implement those type of markets from a technology standpoint. And there has been no shortage of startups that have tried in the last 20 years to implement them. There has been no shortage of economists who have revisited over time Kenneth Loudon idea. There has been no shortage of computer scientists who over time have proposed various type of encryption protocols to support these markets. We still don't have them. Not in the sense that we don't have data markets, of course we do, but we don't have the kind of market Loudon was referring to and that you are referring to when we are talking about using data proprietization, giving consumers property rights over the personal information as a solution to the privacy problem. We don't have that. And there are many reasons. Some, I believe, are behavioral, and some are essentially legacy system, and the fact that much data is already out there and it's in absence of regulatory intervention. A data market would not really be able to fairly compensate consumers for their data when most of the data has already been collected and used and keeps being collected and used every day. But the behavioral angle, the behavioral challenge that these markets face is indeed how to properly assign value to one's own personal information. And I have been indeed skeptical over the years of studies, both from industry and from academia, that attempted to pinpoint an exact number to some type of piece of information, such as, well, consumers value protection of their browsing history $22.5 on average. Not just because consumers are very different from each other, and there is enormous heterogeneity in consumers' preferences and evaluations of personal data, but also because, as you were hinting at, what we know very robustly from empirical research dating back decades, not just from behavior researchers, but also sociologists, psychologists, computer scientists who do HCI usability work, is that privacy evaluations are contextual. And privacy is inherently contextual. And in the same very piece of information in two different contexts may lead to dramatically different consequences once it's used, and therefore will naturally be associated with very different evaluations. So I may not care at all about my data, certain piece of information being owned by a friend of mine, and I wouldn't assign much value to protect that piece of information in another context, that information will be of paramount importance for me to protect. Not only they are valuations are context dependent, but they're also malleable. And here I'm linking back to what we were discussing earlier, the discussion around behavior economics of privacy. When we use behavioral decision research to understand privacy decision making, we also conclude that privacy decision making, and therefore also privacy evaluations, can be affected by a number of factors that, for lack of a better term, we could call non-normative factors. So factors that in theory should not affect valuations, but they do, such as, in my example from earlier, simply how you frame a problem for the consumer. How much would you spend to protect? How much money would you like to receive to give away this personal information? This is just an example. There are many others. And what we have learned is that even very minor variations in how we present privacy choices to consumers through online interfaces can lead to dramatically different outcomes. Perhaps the most powerful example is opt-in or opt-out, right? Whether by default a platform will protect your data unless you agree that the platform could share it with others, or whether instead you have to voluntarily opt in. This will have very, very significant downstream consequences in ultimately the extent to which a consumer data will be protected. So when I see studies which pinpoint numbers, or studies that conclude, consumers do not really care for privacy, because in this study they were willing to give away their personal information for 2 cents, I feel now that's an oversimplification. There are many more nuances that go into that 2 cents for personal data conclusion.
So one thing I'd love to discuss is the privacy paradox, and this is something you've studied in depth. You've had some of the pioneering studies about this phenomenon. Can you describe briefly what the privacy paradox is, and then ultimately how we should understand the privacy paradox?
Absolutely. This is one of the most debated topics in the literature, right? So broadly speaking, the privacy paradox is about the gap or the possible gap or the possible dichotomy or ostensible dichotomy between privacy attitudes and privacy behavior. So between surveys and observation of behavior, between what people say in terms of how much they care about privacy and what people really do. And anecdotal evidence, I was referring to that already in the late 1990s, early 2000s, suggested that there was a gap. In surveys, people claim the privacy is important to them. In action, privacy-enhancing technologies don't do well in the market. Privacy-defeating technologies or disclosure-enhancing technologies such as social media do very well. And from this started a stream of work. I believe one of the very first to empirically document this gap, not just anecdotally, was Sarah Spiekerman in a very interesting experiment, probably conducted in 2000 or 2001, which then and then this field, grew immensely and has been also incredibly heavily and hotly debated. There has been lots of confusion, lots of different views on the paradox. To me, I have to tell you honestly, the problem with the field of research of the privacy paradox is that too much attention, in my view, has been placed on whether the gap or the dichotomy is paradoxical or not. Because many scholars have focused, it's a paradox, or no, it's a paradox, because we can explain why this happens, and therefore it's not a paradox. This may be useful, but to me, too much attention has gone into that because to me, what is important is rather to understand, does the gap exist? And if so, what are the possible explanations for it? Because some explanations are trivial and make the gap not interesting. For instance, one of the early versions of the paradox was that generic privacy attitudes do not predict specific behavior. And soon enough, the literature discovered that, sociologists already had already discovered that generic attitudes do not predict behavior. And so Jane, for instance, already probably in 1970s, 1980s, had already done work on that. And so scholars in the privacy field already in between 2005 and 2010 started pointing out that, look, it's not surprising that generic attitudes in privacy don't predict specific behavior. But then empirical research showed that, sometimes actually even specific attitudes don't predict specific behavior. Why is that? And then a literature started with and many possible explanations were offered. And to me, those many explanations are richness. They are not a problem. So the fact that there are many different explanations does not mean that the field has not come to a consensus. To me, it means that the gap most likely does exist, but not all the time. It can exist, but not all the time. Sometimes attitudes predict behavior, sometimes they don't. Because it would be kind of absurd to assume that attitudes always univocally predict every behavior or never do. It's probably that in some cases they do, in some cases they don't. And secondly, when they do not, the reason, well, it could be many. There is no one size fits all in privacy because, again, privacy is so contextual. So in some cases, a person's attitudes toward privacy in a very specific context may not translate in behavior simply because the consumer is not aware in that particular context that something bad is happening to their data. In other cases, there could be behavioral explanations, such as maybe hyperbolic discounting, immediate gratification bias, etc. In other cases, it could be that the consumer would like to protect privacy, but cannot actually do it feasibly because there are no good alternatives in the marketplace. And the cost of protecting privacy could be overwhelmingly high. So to summarize, I find that I look at the enormous amount of work that has been done on the privacy paradox positively. I hope that we eventually move away from debating whether the gap is paradoxical or not. I don't find it a good usage of our time. I believe that sometimes attitudes predict, sometimes do not predict actual behavior. And I believe that when they don't, there are many explanations. And it's important to understand them, because otherwise we end up using the paradox to conclude that, again, people don't care for privacy. And to me, that's the most naive conclusion one could derive from the privacy paradox literature.
Yeah, I totally agree. A while ago, I wrote a paper on the privacy paradox, and I learned a lot from your work about it. And the conclusion I drew was, a lot of times the people's attitudes are measuring their general attitudes about privacy, but the behaviors are contextual risk decisions. And so from your work, I learned, look at the context. And in the context, this is why people are making certain decisions. But that context doesn't match the overall attitudes about privacy, which are kind of more generalized thinking about general concerns about privacy. And so ultimately, when we're looking at the specific risk context, it's very different, and each one is very different. So, policymakers shouldn't look at that and then conclude that, well, that difference, what you call a gap between these two, is indicative that the attitudes are just misstated, or that the behaviors really reflect some kind of actual not caring about privacy, or that they're very low value of privacy. It's much more complicated than that, and we really need to understand the phenomenon that are going into these decisions. And that a lot of times we see companies structuring decisions in ways that maximize people sharing data, maximize people making decisions that are not necessarily good for their privacy, or not necessarily reflective of their attitudes about privacy. And why are they doing this? Is because decisions are made or structured in certain ways so that leads people to these behaviors, but they're not necessarily animated by the value of privacy. They're shaped by these forces like endowment effect that you mentioned, or ways that the decisions are framed. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about, you mentioned the cost of regulation, and that's been something you've been thinking about. And I'm curious what your take is on some of the different theories and approaches to the cost of privacy regulation, and where you come out, or some of the things that you've learned in your work on that.
Right, and indeed, although I for quite a while I have been doing behavioral economics work when it comes to privacy, I still come from a traditional economic background, and in the last 5-10 years, I have in a way gone back to working on economics of privacy, not just behavioral economics of privacy, because I've been interested in scrutinizing some claims made by the data industry about consumer data collection as an economic win-win. Everyone benefits from it, as well as scrutinizing some results in my own field, which tend to highlight the cost of privacy protections or privacy regulations, from GDPR, to use again example from before, to Apple ATT, the Application Tracking Transparency Framework. There is no shortage of studies that attempt to show the unintended consequences of these interventions in terms of a measurable, quantifiable negative effect on this or that economic variable. Those studies are rigorous in their own, but when you look at the big picture or at the bigger picture, I believe they may be missing the forest for the tree, because by focusing on short-term shocks and typically on direct effects, such as clearly regulations such as the GDPR will have some effect on advertising effectiveness, because when a group of people become less trackable because less information is available about them, clearly advertising budget will reallocate to different group of people. So clearly, if you do a short-term study on the impact on a certain group of people or certain group of publishers, you're likely to find an effect. But to me, the more interesting question and the harder question to tackle is there evidence of downstream long-term economic harm from privacy protection? And I've been trying with a number of colleagues such as Cristobal Cher and Vincent Lefreur and others to do those kind of difficult studies, such as the long-term impact of the GDPR on the availability of high-quality content from news and media websites following the GDPR. And we found no negative impact, right? So when we look at the actual potential damage to consumers, based on the argument that less information available after GDPR in the European data marketplace would have reduced news and media website revenues, and therefore would have, because of reduction in advertising revenues, and thus it would have reduced their ability to produce content, and thus it would have affected consumers negatively. We found no evidence of that, and this is just, the study just came out, was published in Management Science just a couple of months ago. We did the same for ATT. Apple application tracking transparency framework. And again, we found that if you look at the long term, ATT did not seem to have a negative effect on the ability, on the quality and availability of apps on the Apple iTunes app ecosystem. We are trying to do now something similar with Ryan Steed and Eduardo Mustri, CMU, on the impact that applying differential privacy to social science research would have on the results of that research. And we are about to finish the paper, so stay tuned. But in general, what we are seeing when we look at this bigger picture, downstream long-term effects, is that these unintended consequences that industry has focused on so much to oppose privacy regulation, they don't seem to have, there don't seem to be much robust evidence for them. I cannot exclude that negative effects exist. I'm simply saying that the evidence does not seem to be robust. And this is the kind of research that I want to continue doing, because to me it's important to focus on the forest rather than on the tree when it comes to understanding the implications of privacy economics.
Before we sort of, I guess, to wrap up, I guess I'll ask a kind of a catch-all question, which is, across your work, and I mean, this is a bit of an unfair question because you've been at this for, decades now. But I guess if there were a few of the more counterintuitive conclusions you've reached, or particularly impactful conclusions, just a couple more examples of studies that you've done, things that you think are notable for our understanding of the economics of privacy, that could be helpful for policymaking, that could be helpful for people in companies who are trying to make internal decisions about privacy for their companies or for consumers. I'm just curious what your, if you have a few examples of things you could talk about.
Sure, thanks. I'll try. And I will start by saying that there are a few authors in the field of privacy whose work I keep going back to, and one is you, Dan, and the other is Erwin Altman, the American social psychologist, who in the late 1970s wrote a wonderful piece about privacy, and in it he came with this sentence, which I'm going to quote, not exactly verbatim, but I think I would be close enough paraphrasing. Privacy is simultaneously culturally specific and culturally universal. So he was pointing out something that in my own research and reading the work of many other scholars, I found to be eminently and fundamentally true. That privacy is not a modern invention. Privacy is not just a bourgeois value. Privacy is something that seems to be almost inherent in human behavior and human decision making. So in that regard, it's universal. But it's also something that changes dramatically from person to person, from culture to culture, from time to time. But what is common is that there is this need, this desire for people to carve out by themselves the boundaries between public and private. So what I would like to say that is important, I find important about the important lessons from the work that I've been lucky to do with many other scholars, students, and colleagues over the years, is to find evidence that indeed people do care for privacy. And yes, valuations can be malleable and privacy is context dependent, but we should really dispense of the myth that people don't care. We should actually embrace and understand the richness and nuances in privacy decision making. So that's for the behavioral angle. For the economics angle, well, the fact that privacy and economic growth and economic progress are not antithetical. You can have the cake and eat it too. Not all the time. There are some times where privacy protection, I admit it, could have some unintended consequences. But I believe in general, the literature has been way too focused, almost obsessed with those consequences, because by and large, we find more often than not that there are ways for markets, technologies, companies, and societies to adapt to new privacy parameters, privacy technologies and regulations, and grow and prosper. So the notion that privacy is inherently antithetical to positive economic outcomes, to me, is the second notion that we have to dispose of.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. I wish we could go longer, but I really want to be mindful of everyone's time. And we should do a version 2 or a part 2, because there's so much work that you've done. I really recommend that if you are anyone in the audience interested in this issue, check out Alessandro's work. It's a study after study that really has just some really insightful, fascinating findings and analysis. So it's definitely something I recommend you become familiar with. Thank you for joining me. It's been lovely chatting with you, and I really appreciate your being here with me today.
Thank you very much, Dan. Always a pleasure. Thank you.